Okay, welcome everyone. This is always the best part of the program as I see people enter the space. So I'm just going to give you a few more seconds as you get settled. And we are really excited about this program to honor the life of William Still. So let me first provide introductions. I am Deirdre Cooper Owens. I'm the program. I am the director of the program in African American history here at the Library Company. And we are co-sponsoring this program, the William Still's Courageous Life, with the McNeil Center. If you have not been participating, I'm sure they're also going to place some of the videos from the speakers and the panels that have been presented there, but we have been commemorating the life, the courageous life, the interesting life, the complicated and complex life of William Still, who was born 200 years ago. So I want to welcome you to the Library Company. It is the country's oldest cultural institution, founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin. The program in African American history is not as old. However, it has become the anchor program of the Library Company. All of these scholars that you see assembled here have at some point used documents in our library. We have over 1 million pieces of, of writings, ephemera, everything in between. And so we also invite you to visit with us, and you can also go online at www.librarycompany.org to look at some of our digitized collections as well. I am also wanting to give greetings from our director, Dr. Michael Versanti, who was unable to join us today, but extends his greetings. And I am wondering, I love to have us participate in an interactive chat. We have heard that today might be William Still Day, as per I think the Declaration of the City of Philadelphia. So if that is true, let us know, because this means this is a really wonderful occasion. Also, if there are any Still descendants who are joining us, thank you, welcome. Please identify yourselves if you want to do so in the chat. We will have our panelists, who I'll introduce shortly, provide about 10 minutes of commentary on their scholarship still, and on themes around race and slavery and abolition and everything in between, so that we can have a really robust and generative discussion in our Q&A. We ask you to place your questions in the Q&A. Your comments can be left for the chat, and I'll moderate. I'd also like to give one last thanks to our team at the Library Company, Jasmine Smith, who's the Assistant Director of the program in African American history, and also our African American history archival specialist, and Fran Dolan, who has assisted us with technology. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed presenters. Derrick Spires is Associate Professor of Literatures in English and Affiliate Faculty in African American Studies, Visual Studies, and Media Studies at Cornell University. He specializes in early African American and American print cultures, citizenship studies, and African American intellectual history. His first book, The Practice of Citizenship, Black Politics and Print Culture in the Early United States, which was published in 2019 by the University of Pennsylvania Press, won the MLA Prize for the first book and the Bibliographical Society St. Louis Mercantile Library Prize. Congratulations, Derrick. His work appears or is forthcoming in African American Review, American Literary History, and edited collections on early African American print culture and the Colored Conventions movement. Alex Black is Assistant Professor of English at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow of African American literature at Rutgers University. Alex studies the print and performance cultures of the 19th century anti-slavery movement Some of his research on William Still, which was supported with fellowship at Historical Society of Pennsylvania, our neighbor, literally right next door, and the Library Company of Philadelphia, was published in the winter 2020 issue of American Literary History. His work has also appeared in American Quarterly and J19, with Brigitte Fielder and Joanna Ortner. Alex co-edited Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's Forrest Lee's For Just, Teach One, Early African American Print. Welcome. Manisha Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition and Civil War and Reconstruction. She is the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico in 2015, and recently featured in the New York Times's 1619 Project. Her multiple award-winning second monograph, and trust me, it won a lot of awards, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction and won the 2017 Frederick Douglass Prize. She is a member of the board of the Society of Civil War Historians and of the Council of Advisors of the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery at the Schomburg, a part of the New York Public Library system. She's currently writing a book on the greater reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War, which is under contract with Live Right, which is a subsidiary of Norton. Welcome, Manisha. And lastly, William Kashatus is the author of William Still, The Underground Railroad and the Angel at Philadelphia. Professor Kashatus curated Just Over the Line, Chester County, and the Underground Railroad, recognized by the Journal of American History as a first-rate exhibit and model of outreach to the local community, and winner of the American Association of Historical Societies and Museums Award of Merit. He is the author or co-author, get this, of 30 books, including Harriet Tubman, a biography, and In Pursuit of Freedom, Teaching the Underground Railroad. He currently teaches at Luzerne County Community College in Northeast Pennsylvania. Welcome, Bill. Welcome, all of you. And Derrick, I'd like for you to go first. Also, I think someone, before you go, let's see here. Oh my goodness, we have a Still descendant. Welcome, Winifred Still Davis, Secretary of the Still Family Historical Committee in Lawnside, New Jersey. Welcome so much. All right, Derrick.
Hey, good evening, everyone, or late afternoon or night, wherever you are, Zoom world. I feel like we need to have Stevie Wonder's Happy Birthday playing in the background or something, and cake. Maybe next round, yeah. Thank you, Deirdre Cooper Owens and Jasmine Smith. Thanks to the Library Company and the McNeil Center for convening us today. I'm looking forward to the conversations to continue celebrating William Still. This is going to be a full weekend and should be fun. I just want to take a few minutes to sit with William Still's Underground Railroad, the Mammoth Collection, published in 1872 initially, and then reprinted in multiple editions across the late 18th century, late 19th century, because it's one, it can be difficult to read. It's sort of like the Bible. You try to read it from cover to cover and it doesn't quite work that well. But I think there is still a craft and logic to the book, and it is a key example of both Black communal self-authorship, because it's a compilation, but also in terms of an example of Still savvy as a business person and as a printer. And it helps us see local networks in a sort of narrative way that is still one of the, at least for me, clearest representations of the people involved with the road from a on-the-ground personal level. Still wrote sketches for the collection that clearly draw on narratives of enslavement. It draws on journalistic traditions, draws on biography of Frances Harper in particular, and Still's sketch of Frances Harper is still one of the best biographies of Harper out there. There's more work to be done on Harper for sure. And at the same time, he organized over 800 pages of primary source materials in ways that are as formally compelling as William Wells Brown's Clotel, W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's that complex. Despite this monumental effort, literary accounts of Still's text remain elusive. We go to it for its sort of documentary value, but thinking about it in terms of form, we're still a little bit behind on. Partly because he published during Reconstruction, which remains an area of weakness in the scholarship more broadly, though that's changing. At the same time, like I said, the form of the book is difficult to pin down. It's composed of as told to narratives, epistolary stories, ads, legal documents, sketches, and more, including Harper's poetry. Historian Stephen Hall includes this in his account of Black history writing. Drea Williams describes it as a social history. Julie Roy Jeffrey thinks about it in terms of anti-slavery memoir, and John Ernest describes it as a book of fragments. Back in 1950, the Negro History Bulletin Review dubbed it an epic in the struggle. And even the catch-all phrase documentary history seems insufficient for thinking about Still's craft as a curator and shaper of narrative. So that remains my personal choice. I still think of him more as a curator of narrative. And none of this is helped by the fact that, as Jeffrey notes, Still really did add things out of order because he came across them in his attic archive only after the printer had already completed work on the section where it might have been more appropriate. So there's a level of haphazardness or ordered chaos, maybe, to the book. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on ways that I approach reading the Underground Railroad. First, a little publication history for those who are unfamiliar. After an initial small run in 1871, Still contracted with white Philadelphia publishers Porter and Coates to publish Underground Railroad in 1872. As Stephen Hall and Alex Backtrace, Still's contract stipulated that all publication rights would revert to him after 1 year, and this was a bit of both print and economic savvy. Still spent the next 6 years cultivating a network of agents from Philadelphia to California who would receive 50 to 60% of the profits, and he released a new and expanded edition in 1878 to much success, which included a fine English cloth of $4.50, paneled style decorated of $5, cheap library style of $5.50, and half turkey Morocco, so those nice red bound copies for $6.50, which is to say that the book could be as much about producing an art object. It's important to have that book on the table as it is about the content. The book itself opens with a request from the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society to compile and publish its personal reminiscences and experiences related to the Underground Railroad. But instead of doing that, Still tells the story through the voices of other less visible and more vulnerable people involved with the road: fugitives, conductors, correspondents, funders, most of whom are Black and with more attention given to women than most of his contemporaries. And even when Still draws attention to those who demand special reference, he does so with a spirit of collaboration. Singular stories like Henry Box Brown's get recontextualized so that Brown recedes in favor of S.A. Smith, who, quote, at the sad cost to himself and many of the best years of his life in Richmond Penitentiary, boxed up Henry Box Brown and others in Richmond. The repetition of fugitive acts, the constant movement, all of the variegated ways folks maintain this motion connect the narratives and the people in Still's text. Still intersperses letters and collections of letters both within and between stories about individual cases, but neither these collections nor the letters in aggregate appear in chronological order. It's as if the temporal narrative doesn't matter. At the same time, each letter writer seems to have their own code or idiosyncratic version of a shared code for talking about fugitives and the work, whether based in biblical parables, the ubiquitous reference to packages or food, and other sort of euphemisms. One writer who Still identifies as enslaved and an Underground Railroad agent writes from Petersburg, Virginia in 1860 that he has, quote, some very good hams on hand that I would like very much for you to have, and signs the letter Ham and Eggs. Mm-hmm. Ham and Eggs might have worked in a tavern like Harriet Jacobs' grandmother. The code might offer a clue to his work, doing inventory, maybe even keeping the books. It implies stealing away and a host of other freedom practices. And at the same time, signing his name ham and eggs gives away the game. He's showing off a little bit. Right? There's a little bit of humor in the practice of the Underground Railroad. There are writers who will use a code and then near the end of the letter say, oh, by the way, by this, I meant this, just in case Steele didn't catch on, right? When I want to draw out here is less this fragmentation, which is there and is an important part of Steele's, the way Steele cultivates his history, but rather that Steele's text produces the practice of the road on the level of the form. What was Steele's experience of the road? Reading these fragments gives us a taste, and his agents reproduce its ranging network. It's performative in some ways. And like Clotel or the Color Convention minutes, the pieces making up the Underground Railroad are knit together by a trusted, knowing narrative hand. So here's what I mean. One more example. The book opens with Seth Conklin, the narrative of the eponymous white abolitionist who died attempting to reunite William Steele's brother, Peter Steele, with his wife and children. The way Steele unfolds the narrative is as rich as its content. Conklin's letters constitute an epistolary narrative with a serial logic. The story unfolds over time and space as Conklin travels by steamer, rowboat, carriage, and foot from Philadelphia to Alabama, from Alabama to Ohio and Indiana. Supplementary letters from Levi Coffin and A.R. Johnson reveal how difficult it was to obtain accurate information about Conklin's death. He either escaped capture and drowned in flight or was intentionally drowned. This epistolary mode gives a panoramic view of the process while simultaneously producing a sense of narrative and tension and excitement. Yet, at least some of Steele's readers would have already known how the story ends because Conklin's case was widely publicized, and portions of Peter's narrative had already appeared in print in 1856 as The Kidnapped and the Ransomed, being the personal recollections of Peter Steele and his wife, Vina, by K.E.R. Picard. At the same time, no one had heard either narrative from this particular angle. Steele fills in details Peter could not publish out of fear of endangering himself and others. The Seth Conklin sketch then uses Conklin as a hook to tell a much broader story that begins with the separation of a Black family and ends with their reunification. Conklin as a white martyr is critical to this narrative, but he is not central, and neither are Peter and Vina Steele for that matter, at least not totally. Instead, the road itself becomes a kind of collective character. And as we learn of its travail, Steele develops it along the way. Steele follows the Seth Conklin narrative with a random assemblage titled Underground Railroad Letters, a collection of 17 letters to Steele from formerly enslaved folk, agents on the road, lawyers, and enslaved people who act as agents. These letters, running from 1851 to 1857, do not appear in chronological order, and don't include narrative frames outside the title for each entry, and yet there's a principle of organization here. They flesh out the network that Conklin's efforts introduced to us. The letter writers don't know or rarely mention each other, but they participate in common. And in as much as the letters produce a kind of serial network, the letters also show Steele as part of it. Some letters ask him to send or forward letters to others to ensure that the original sender's location remains hidden. This dispersed connectivity seems to be the point. Steele ends the section with an 1851 missive from Theodosia Gilbert, asking after Conklin and speculating after the nature of his death. His body was found drowned in iron chains with a fractured skull. We come full circle. If the Underground Railroad were a composition, I'd call it jazz. Think of So What or Coltrane's My Favorite Things. The Peter Conklin Steele narrative sets the theme, subsequent texts elaborate and improvise on it, sometimes changing key, instrumentation, and tempo, but always returning us to the central points about Black liberation through collective effort. Thank you.
That's good stuff.
Thank you. Alex?
Yes, thank you. I also want to begin by thanking Deirdre and Jasmine, and I also want to thank Derrick as well. The journal in which my William Steele article was published was edited very, skillfully by Derrick, and it's a great issue. That article in particular is about the publication kind of process, part of which Derrick recounted for us just now. But something that I talk about in that article briefly is the role that Caroline Still, who was William and Letitia's eldest daughter, played in the kind of the composition of the book itself in helping William Still arrange the materials. But also what I focus on is the role that Caroline played in managing the publication. So, Still also has the coal business. So there's times where Still is there and the management of the book publication, writing agents, talking to editors, things of that sort is being handled by Caroline at the home office. And so one of the things that's interested me, especially about Still and studying these papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and elsewhere in Philadelphia, are the role of the Still family and the Still women in particular in the creation and preservation of these materials. And so when I was first studying, as a fellow back in, I think, 2016 in Philadelphia, the main kind of source I was consulting in my research was a letter book, a copy press letter book. So in other words, a book in which a year's worth of William Still's correspondence had been copied into this particular mechanical process. In addition to seeing letters written by elsewhere by Caroline talking about, working in the office or things like that, something that I discovered or realized, something that I learned in studying this letter book was that Caroline would have written or copied out some of those letters themselves. And so it made me start thinking more about this, particular artifact, not only of the publication process and corresponding with editors and agents, but also with the role of Caroline and the family in running this publishing business, which is what they did. And so, alongside me trying to learn about this publishing business, I was thinking more and more about the preservation of the papers and what made it possible for me to study them in the first place. And so there had been an article by Joyce Lynn Moody published in Legacy around this time, the journal Legacy, on African-American print culture studies. And Moody prompts or asks scholars, where are the women in Black print culture studies? So, for the increasing number of scholars who study African-American print culture, where are the studies that are focused on women and that are highlighting the roles that they play? And so, as I've been saying, part of what we see in studying the Still papers is the role of the Still family and the Still daughters in particular. And so, something that I just briefly mentioned in the article that I will, I'm going to throw a couple of quotes in the chat if I can. If not, I will share a link with you all. But there is in 1921, 1922, Monroe Work, who was the director of the Department of Records and Research at the Tuskegee Institute, publishes this yearbook. And he did it for, it was an annual book, and it covered many different kinds of topics, lots of statistics, lots of histories, books being published by African Americans and the African diaspora. But there's a particular entry in Work's installment for that year where he refers to specific special collections about African Americana and Africana. And if you look at the list, some of these names are very familiar to us. Some of these names or institutions have connections to Philadelphia in particular. Schomburg is there. So this is in the years before Schomburg sells his collection to the New York Public Library, but obviously Schomburg and these others are known as collectors and are participating in different kinds of associations of other collectors and bibliophiles. But here among this list is this, and I'll just quote it: the William Still Collection of Original Matter on Underground Railroad, in possession, Miss Frances E. Still, Philadelphia. And Miss Frances E. Still is William and Letitia Still's youngest or younger daughter. Frances Ellen is her full name. And Frances Ellen ends up donating the family's papers, or what she has of William Still's papers and records, to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in about 8 years. So I wrote this down in 1931. So this is still kind of in the decade before that. And so to me, one of the reasons why this is meaningful is because it shows us not only kind of in whose custody these papers remain and the legacy who's one of the people tending the legacy of the Still family, but that it's known, right? It wasn't, a hidden, or, it was not, like, it would have been well known to people like Monroe Work and to others who were interested in like causes. And so this letter book I was first talking about, and that was my principal source in learning about the Still publishing enterprise, was one of the items donated by Frances Ellen Still. And when you open it, there's a photocopy of like the original binding. Like, I think the binding has been removed, or it was conserved in some way. But in the interior is a book plate, noting that Frances Ellen donated it and when. For when I was looking at scholars who had published on William Still recently, many had consulted these papers, but I don't recall seeing anyone mentioning the fact that Frances Ellen was the one who possessed these and then donated them. So I became more and more interested in collecting, in preservation as a family enterprise, as a family practice. And so in my research in Philadelphia, in addition to going to the Library Company and the Historical Society, I also did research at the Blockson Collection. And the Blockson Collection has, many papers and other artifacts from the Stills. And my sense, it's called the William Still Collection, but my sense is that it's Caroline's papers. And so there's a letter that William Still sends to Caroline, and I will again copy and paste a bit of it for you into the chat. William Still sends this letter to Caroline in September 1874. Caroline is accompanying Frances Ellen to Oberlin. So Frances Ellen is about to begin studying at Oberlin. And, this is just part of this letter. The family refers to Frances Ellen as Ella, so that's who's being named in this first part of my excerpt. Part of what William Still, William is asking Caroline to tell Frances Ellen, to like be a good boarder. She's going to be boarding with a local family, to keep track of your expenditures, to be kind of a responsible person now that you're out on your own and things of that sort. But in the middle of this passage, or toward the middle, William asks Caroline, to tell Frances Ellen that I expect letters from her weekly, and I will send her letters as well. And then I'll quote just a quick part of it. William writes, "It has occurred to me that each one of us should carefully keep all the letters that thus pass between us." And then William still goes on to talk about, in addition to doing things like that, Frances Ellen kind of can keep track of her finances, and that this will be kind of part of her education and something that the rising generation could use. This kind of method and system, which also includes preserving your personal and family papers. And again, from my citation, it's obvious that this letter was preserved, and it's at the Blockson Collection. It was donated by the family in the 1980s. And so, as I've been saying, like, preservation and collection was a family practice, right? It's something that they all participated in, and that we benefit from over these many decades. And so there was one additional quote I wanted to share with you, or something else that I don't mention in my article, but that is interesting in this direction. This is from part of a letter that William Still writes to James T. Still in 1873. So again, this is still during the period that William Still is in charge of the publication of his book, or the first year that he's in charge of it, taking over from Porter and Coates. And in this letter, and again, sorry for all the text, but here it is anyway. William is telling James, his nephew, about a reunion that happened recently. And this letter is from 1873, so it's William Still is recounting one of the earliest Still family reunions. They continue to this day, of course, and so it's great to see a particular one mentioned here. And in the letter, William talks about kind of who was present, some of the places they visited in kind of the ancestral home and region in southern New Jersey. And at the end of it, William Still has this kind of meditation on memory and recalling the past and the difficulty or impossibility of doing that. So the last two sentences I have in the chat are, "During the very short time that these old scenes were passing under review, I assure you many things that had long lay dormant was revived and brought afresh to memory again. Yet the past is gone forever, despite all we may do to have it recalled. And so it's this stirring kind of meditation on the past and thinking of, who in their family were not present because they lived elsewhere or they had passed away. But as I was reading this letter, kind of doing research in one of these summers in 2015 and 2016, as I returned to Philadelphia, this letter is in the letter book, the one I've been talking about, and the one that is the main source where Still is talking to his agents, talking to editors, talking to friends, looking for agents and advertising for the book. And elsewhere in this letter, William Still talks to James about how the book is going and how the selling of the book is going. William is especially interested in finding a really good agent for Boston because that seems like a place where the book should really sell. And either because William Still talks about the book in this letter, or maybe just because the letter book was a place to kind of retain this kind of information, this kind of document. Here is where it is. And so just to conclude, like one of the things I'm continuing to learn about and hoping to revisit Philadelphia in the near future to learn more about is kind of this moment in the 20th century where Frances Ellen, is going to donate and then does donate these materials, and kind of the circle of people that she's associated with at that time as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for keeping that chat interactive as well. All right, next we'll have Manisha.
Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the library company also for hosting us today. I'm going to situate my talk in the abolitionist movement, situate William Still in the abolition movement. And I apologize if I take the 12 minutes rather than the 10 minutes, Deirdre, for my presentation, but I will try to go as fast as possible. So the significance of William Still's Underground Railroad in the making of abolition and the sexual conflict cannot be overstated. William Lloyd Garrison called runaways and rebels, quote, self-emancipated slaves, rejecting the term fugitive as criminalizing freedom-seeking enslaved people. Now, slaves voted against slavery with their feet, and abolitionists assisted them from the early days of the Republic. Over the years, the abolitionist underground grew into a fairly organized system of vigilance committees, safe houses, and anti-slavery lawyers and politicians who took fugitive slave cases into northern state and courthouses. Runaways gave abolition its most enduring issue, the fugitive slave controversy, and its most dynamic exponents, fugitive slave abolitionists. Now, the history of the Underground Railroad must rise above the story of heroic individuals or dismissed as the stuff of myth and memory. It must be placed in its proper context, the growth of the abolition movement. Outstanding Quakers Isaac T. Hopper, Levi Coffin, and the Presbyterian minister John Rankin, whose careers bridged the two waves of abolition, made assistance to runaways a quintessential form of abolitionist activism. As a member of the famed Pennsylvania Abolition Society, to which William Still also belonged, Hopper became widely known, quote, as the friend and legal advisor of colored people upon all emergencies. He moved to New York City, where he worked with the Black abolitionist David Ruggles in the New York Committee of Vigilance, the first of its kind, founded in 1835. Now, Black abolitionists helped establish the permanent organizational apparatus of the Underground Railroad, the vigilance committees of the 1830s. A decade earlier, African Americans in Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore had formed protection societies against kidnapping. Ruggles, who helped found and became secretary of the New York Committee of Vigilance, was the person most responsible for this tactical innovation. At personal risk, Ruggles confronted slave catchers and the kidnapping club in New York that consisted of local officials and law enforcement. The vigilance committees had a predominantly African-American membership, but also included white abolitionists. Calling themselves, quote, friends of human rights, these committees assisted fugitive slaves or freedom seekers and rescued kidnapped Southern and local free Blacks, the enslaved involved in the slave trade, the slaves in transit with their masters in free states. Often denied trial by jury and legal rights, vigilance committees hired anti-slavery lawyers to represent African Americans caught between slavery and freedom. These committees galvanized grassroots Black activism ready to intimidate slave catchers and law enforcement officials in cahoots with them. Black women not only raised funds for the vigilance committees, but they also took part in street action to rescue suspected runaways. Confrontations over fugitive slaves instigated by abolitionists and African Americans challenged federal and constitutional guarantees on rendition in the North. The 1837 case of Basil Dorsey resurrected the efforts of the old Pennsylvania Abolition Society to help escape slaves from neighboring slave states of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. It led to the founding of the Philadelphia Vigilant Committee by Black abolitionists Robert Purvis and others. Its most active member was its agent, a Black barber, Jacob C. White, whose meticulous minute book of the Vigilant Committee of Philadelphia still survives. A statewide network of Black and white abolitionists, many Quakers, helped build the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. In 1847, James McKim reorganized it as the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. Its most active member and, quote, chairman was William Still, who eventually documented its history and published the stories of the runaways it assisted in the Underground Railroad in 1872, as we just heard. Now, Still was not just a participant in the abolitionist underground, both as victim and rescuer. He was also its first historian. He left behind vignettes, portraits, and one-of-a-kind documentation of the heroism of freedom seekers, but also the men and women who comprised this resistant community. Harriet Tubman, whom he assisted often, Thomas Garrett, Quaker abolitionist and station master of the Underground Railroad in Delaware, and his close friend Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who generously donated her lecture fees to Still for assisting fugitive slaves. Still saw himself primarily as an abolitionist activist, situating himself in a long tradition of Anglo-American abolitionism, naming his children after the British abolitionist parliamentarian William Wilberforce, and closest to home, Frances Ellen Still, whom we just heard about. Now, other Black abolitionists, such as Germaine Lagoon in Syracuse, Stephen and Harriet Myers of Albany, Thomas and Frances Brown of Pittsburgh, John and Mary Jones in Chicago, and Lewis and Harriet Hayden in Boston, were mainstays of vigilance committees. Detroit's Colored Vigilant Committee also acted as an immigration society, and soon these committees spread to Canada among fugitive slave communities. In New York City, Sidney Howard Gay, editor of the Garrisonian National Anti-Slavery Standard, kept a 2-volume record of fugitives he assisted. The central figure in his operations was a remarkable Black man, Louis Napoleon, who did most of the dangerous street work and transporting of runaways. In his records, Gay noted the many freedom seekers Still and the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee forwarded to him from points further south and their onward journeys to upstate New York and Canada. Now, the abolitionist underground consisted not so much of the elaborate routes mapped by the historian Wilbur Siebert, but of distinct sites of activist, interracial abolitionism and anti-slavery politics. Like parts of Ohio, the port towns of New Bedford and Boston, South Central Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, Detroit, Western Illinois and Chicago, upstate New York and New York City, and the area around the District of Columbia. Free Black communities, especially in the racially hostile Northwestern states and border slave states, were essential to the social geography of fugitive slave resistance. Northern Black communities contained fugitive slaves who intermarried with free African Americans and came to resemble maroon communities of runaways, determined to defend their freedom at all costs. The homes of James W.C. Pennington in Hartford, Frederick Douglass in Rochester, Henry Highland Garnett in Troy, William Wells Brown in Buffalo, and George D. Baptiste in Detroit were known as safe houses for runaways. AME churches founded by itinerant minister and later Bishop William Paul Quinn in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Indiana were havens for escaped slaves. By the 1840s and 1850s, organized abolitionist assistance to freedom seekers became popularly known as the Underground Railroad. Now, abolitionists did not pass out the difference between slave escapes, kidnapping of free Blacks, or slaveholders in transit with their slaves in free states. Their aim were to make the draconian fugitive slave laws a dead letter through legal means or by direct action. Many started running off slaves, which was risky business. Still's famous book began with the poignant story of his brother Peter Still, who with another brother, Levin, was sold into slavery by their Maryland enslaver after their enslaved mother, Charity, escaped to freedom. William Still was born free in New Jersey, but by the slave laws of Maryland, he could still have been hauled into slavery. Still's family story no doubt motivated his activism on behalf of the numerous enslaved people he assisted. While Levin perished in slavery, by sheer coincidence, Peter purchased his freedom and met William, who figured out he was his long-lost brother. You know, truth is always stranger than fiction. But Peter pined for his wife and children in Alabama. And when Seth Conklin, an abolitionist, quote, wholly insensible of fear, read about his story, he offered to bring his family out of slavery. And we heard a bit about this from Derrick. The plan, Still confided, was known only to him and McKim, and they never sought the approval of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, whose activities did not include slave running. Conklin managed to spirit Peter's family all the way to Indiana, where his luck ran out and he was apprehended at Vincennes, and the Marshal of Evansville jailed the entire group. Peter's family was carried back into slavery, and Conklin, quote, was found drowned with his hands and feet in chains and his skull fractured, as we just heard again. Now, Peter did not give up the idea of redeeming his captive family after Conklin's death. Still entered into negotiations with his enslaver, who demanded $5,000 for his wife and his 3 children. Peter undertook a fundraising tour in the abolitionist lecture circuit, and by 1854 collected enough money to ransom his family though one of his sons was forced to leave a child behind. On obtaining their freedom, Peter and his wife Lavinia legalized their marriage. Their entire story rendered in a fictionalized romantic account by an Alabama school teacher who knew Peter. Kate E.R. Pickard, her book, The Kidnapped and the Ransomed, was published in 1856, as we just heard from Derrick too. Now, a new generation of fugitive slave abolitionists, of whom Frederick Douglass was only the most famous, came to lead the movement, and their amazing narratives of slavery and escape came to constitute what I call the movement literature of abolition. Still, the Underground Railroad, with its remarkable stories of disguise, hairbreadth escapes of men like Henry Box Brown, who parceled himself to freedom, and William and his light-skinned wife, Ellen Craft, who rode the Overground Railroad all the way to freedom, disguised as master and slave, resembles fugitive slave narratives. At the same time, it is a historical document of the abolition movement, containing portraits of the lives and activism of a score of Black and white abolitionists, as was just noted. Now, in the crisis decade of the 1850s, fugitive slave abolitionists radicalized the movement, advocating direct action against the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. As Lagoon, a fugitive slave himself, said, quote, "It outlaws me and I outlaw it." While slaveholders and law enforcement summarily kidnapped suspected runaways, abolitionists reactivated the vigilance committees to coordinate resistance. During this time, the abolitionist underground kicked into high gear. And if you probably know about all those dramatic stories of fugitive slave rescues, what I call fugitive slave rebellions of the 1850s, from the Christiana riot in Pennsylvania to the rescue of John Price in Oberlin, Wellington. Still, as the pivotal figure in the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, personally assisted, over 400 slaves escaped to freedom at this time. According to him, the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee not only rescued self-emancipated slaves from being re-enslaved, but also to help free slaves brought by their masters to the North. In July 1855, Colonel John H. Wheeler, the U.S. Minister Plenipotentiary Designate to Nicaragua, traveled to Philadelphia with his slave, Jane Johnson, and her 2 sons. Still received an anonymous note probably from one of the Black hotel staff where they were staying, describing their plight. Enlisting the Quaker abolitionist Passmore Williamson to accompany him, Still hurried to the ferry to confront Wheeler. After a heated exchange and scuffle, Jane and her 2 sons left with them, while Wheeler was held down by 2 of the 5 Black dock workers present, of whom Still wrote, quote, "Too much cannot be said in commendation." Williamson, who had worked for years quietly in the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, was arrested and imprisoned. He became an overnight abolitionist celebrity, visited by Douglass and Tubman, and feted in the anti-slavery press. The National Black Convention that met in Philadelphia that year sent a delegation to wait on him. He was released on a nolle prosequi, meaning they didn't prosecute, when Jane Johnson appeared dramatically in court, testifying that she had left Wheeler of her own free will. She eventually made her home in Boston, and one of her sons served in the 55th Massachusetts during the Civil War. Still and the 5 dock workers were arrested for riot, assault, battery, and, quote, highway robbery for stealing slave property in transit. The men were locked up, denied food, and given an exorbitant bail of $7,000 each. Of the 5, 2 were convicted, fined $10, and imprisoned for a week. They in turn sued their jailers for, quote, corrupt and malicious conduct, and for the inhumane conditions they had endured during their imprisonment. The abolitionist underground was a dress rehearsal for the war against slaveholders. Still himself worked with the Black Union Army soldiers at Camp William Penn during the Civil War. He also became involved in the fight against racial segregation in public transportation, in Freedmen's Aid, Relief, and Education, and wrote his magnum opus on the abolitionist underground. His life work intertwined seamlessly with his personal story and his activism. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this period of his life from our last speaker. Now, the historical legacy of Still and the Underground Railroad, like the abolition movement that he described so well and movingly, is perhaps even larger. In their long fight against the fugitive slave laws, abolitionists came to criticize the criminalization of Blackness and a racist law enforcement apparatus in the American Republic. These are injustices we still battle today. Thanks so much, and I'll hand over the floor to William.
Thank you. Oh, William, you need to unmute.
Okay. There we go. First of all, how do you follow 3 acts like that? I am not only impressed, but humbled by what I've just heard, and have a lot of suggestions on works if anybody's interested in following them, but I think we've heard some really wonderful things. I come to the table with a bit different background. I'm a Quaker. I was raised in Quaker schools, educated in Quaker schools. So I learned about the Underground Railroad and abolitionism from quite a different angle. I'm a public historian. I would not necessarily call myself a scholarly historian, but a public historian who does write on abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, and I'm a biographer. So a lot of my work deals with the motives of a person and their life and their contributions. I came to William Still really from an interest in working on Quaker abolitionism, because Still was very, very involved with Quaker abolitionists who gave him his start in Philadelphia. Philadelphia in the 1850s was a city of approximately 250,000 people and 20,000 free Blacks, which was the largest free Black population in any city in the country at that period of time. Still came to Philadelphia in 1844, inspired by his background of being the son of former slaves, and worked at odd jobs until 1847, when he was hired as the janitor and mail clerk for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He was a very diligent worker and proved to be invaluable in the business of the Historical Society. And soon he was given an additional responsibility of gathering intelligence and monitoring intelligence on freedom seekers who were coming through the area. And this he took very, very seriously, particularly after August 6th, 1850, when he met his long brother, Peter, and was well, I can't say reunited, but met him for the first time. Still was made the chair of the new Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. There had been a Philadelphia Vigilance Committee that was run by Robert Purvis in the late 1830s and 40s, but was dismantled during the Great Philadelphia Race Riots of 1847. So the new Vigilance Committee was run by a four-man executive committee, still headed that. And he started taking interviews of every single runaway that came under his care. 995 to be exact. A dear friend of mine, James McGowan, who was the editor of the online Harriet Tubman Journal for many years, passed in 2008, and he started this database looking into William Still's Runaways. He got about a third of the way through it and asked me to finish it, which I did, and then did a multivariate analysis on it. And the findings were, to me, startling. Now, again, we're talking about the eastern line of the Underground Railroad, which really begins in the border states of Maryland and Delaware, and then runs through Philadelphia, the nerve center, and then up into New York and eventually Canada. But what I found, and primarily I was working off of a seminal work called The Runaways, done by Lauren Schweniger and the great historian John Hope Franklin, because they had done a statistical analysis on runaways, but it was a random population. It wasn't a fixed population like Still's. Most of Still's runaways came from Maryland, Delaware, and Northern Virginia. And that source is known as the most authoritative source of the Underground Railroad. So what I found in the multivariate analysis, and I'll just give you three findings that jumped out at me. Number one, on the eastern line, water escapes were much greater than they were elsewhere in the country. The historiography stresses that the overwhelming majority escaped on foot and overland. But Still's runaway, the most common method, or at least 40-some%, was on watercraft. Whether it was a steamship, whether it was a skiff, schooner, boat, whatever. And this would make sense because a lot of these runaways came from the Chesapeake Bay area, so they had access to waterways. A second major finding is that rewards among Still's runaways are higher than the 5% of the total that was assumed. The historiography claims that the rewards offered was based on 5% or less of the fugitive's total value. Thus, a fugitive worth $1,600 in 1860 would bring a maximum reward of just $80. Of the 73 cases where a reward is given in William Still's book, 53 had a reward of between $150 and $500. And if the 5% theory is applied, those slaves would be worth between $3,000 and $10,000 each, which of course is extremely high for a slave. And what we have to remember is that by 1860, the 4 million slaves in the United States were worth an estimated $3 billion. The value of slaves fluctuated. But generally in the 1850s, young men between the ages of 18 and 30 would be sold for between $700 and $1,000 each, and healthy females in childbearing years could be worth twice that much. The last, I would say, major finding, although there are other differences between Still's fugitives and others that Schweniger and Franklin were looking at, was individual versus group escapes. Historiography generally claims that single male fugitives ran away because they had few to no family ties. In slavery, they tended to travel alone. In other words, those males with families and females remained in bondage in order to keep their families together. What I found, of the 995 runaways that Still interviewed or assisted, 660 or 66% escaped in 173 groups of 2 or more members, compared to 336 or 34% who traveled alone. And the largest group of those runaways was 28, and it consisted of 4 large families. 5 other groups had 10 or more members. 20 additional groups consisted of 6 to 8 runaways, and all of these had family members. What is this telling me? That desires to keep families together led Still's runaways to escape bondage, not to stay in it. Now, of course, there can be that difference between before 1850 and after 1850, when the numbers of fugitives drastically increased because of fear of being broken up and being sold. But those are just 3. Those are just 3 of probably 7 or 8 findings that I had, and I would say the 3 major findings. And what Jim, my friend, Jim McGowan, and I had hoped when we had done this is that this would be a starting point for anybody that was interested in the Underground Railroad, and that scholars in the future would have to look at this. But we also wanted to provide people who are doing genealogy with that data. And the book does have that data. There's 43 pages in it that gives you all the names of those 995 runaways, aliases, where they escaped from, and so forth. And as I was doing the research on Still, though, and being a biographer, the statistical part became much less important. William Still wrote The Underground Railroad for 4 reasons. First and foremost, he was the son of slaves. He knew and saw the pain that his mother felt because she left 2 young sons in bondage in order for her and her 2 daughters to escape. That was the only way she could do it. And this, the influence, it cannot be understated, because he wanted, and when he wrote this book, when he took these interviews, his objective was to reunite families that were divided in slavery. I would love to know how many were reunited. There's no way of telling that, but that was the major reason he did this. I'd say the second reason he did this is that he was a historian. He's the first Black historian of the Underground Railroad. Most of the accounts that were given after the Civil War ended were by white Quakers who were Underground Railroad agents, and they touted their own achievements. But this is a Black historian, and Still was very, very sensitive about the fact that he did not have the education that some people had. And he wanted to show people that a Black man could write history and could do good history, solid history. The third reason he wrote this is basically to show that, unlike what the white historians had done on the Underground Railroad, that the fugitives themselves were every bit as important, if not more important, in the success of their escapes than the agents were. These 995 freedom seekers were intelligent, they were resourceful, they had to be in order to make that track. And he wanted to let them give their accounts. And they did. I mean, this is, frankly, this is oral history at its finest. Something that by the Academy had not been respected. The Academy, if it was oral history, the Academy rejected it. Up until recently, everything had to be documented. And yet, if you look at Africans and African Americans, traditionally the way those peoples tell their history is through oral history. So that has to be respected. And I think still did that. And the final reason he did this, and this is the sad reason for me, at least. After the end of the Civil War, William Still became a pioneer of civil rights. And he worked to create equal opportunity for Blacks in Pennsylvania, specifically in the city of Philadelphia. And his causes were integrating the streetcars in the city of Philadelphia and restoring Black suffrage, which was lost with the new Pennsylvania Constitution of 1838. He worked assiduously at this, and he used moral suasion, which was his tack or tactic during for abolitionism pre-Civil War. This new generation of civil rights pioneers led by Octavius Catto were very different. They used direct action. They worked through the political process. They confronted discrimination. And unlike Still, they also enjoyed life. They went to the theater, they danced, they had a baseball team. They enjoyed sports. And Still, being the man he was, very frugal, very serious, very committed, he saw these things as frivolous and refused to work with them when they were working on the same causes together. Fortunately, Catto and his young reformers prevailed. And it's not that Still stopped working on either one of those causes. He really didn't. He had to defend himself, and he had to defend his position and moral suasion. But he worked on both these causes until they were realized in the 1860s. And frankly, they were realized because white radical Republicans wanted to court the Black vote and realized they needed the Black vote in order to stay in office. But he worked on it right up to the end. And if nothing else, he paved the way for Catto and that younger generation of reformers to succeed. Of course, Catto was considered a martyr to Black voting rights because he was killed in October of 1871, trying to rally Black support for the Republican mayoral candidate at that period of time. But I think Still leaves us with a mixed legacy because of this. And that mixed legacy, and we can see this really starting from William Still and then going to the turn of the century with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and then moving right into the 1960s with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, that there is a dialectic in the approach to civil rights for Blacks. On one hand, there is staying with the system and working within the system and waiting for those rights to take their course through the courts and through government. And then there's direct action, which is confronting the discrimination and forcing that change. And as history has shown us, we need both approaches, or it's not going to happen. And had Still, I believe, had Still joined with that younger group of reformers, then he probably would have been the greatest reformer to ever come out of the city of brotherly love. And to me, he's a tragic hero, a wonderful contributor to abolitionism, but in terms of civil rights, he fell short.
Thank you to our panelists. I will remind our audience members, if you have questions, to please use the Q&A tab. But I'm going to do something a little different. I want you to respond to each other if you have questions, if you need clarification about things that were said, because I really want you all to have a conversation. This is a collection of some of the country's best minds on abolitionism and William Still. And so we have a really right moment here to have a generative discussion around all that you presented. So who would like to go first?
If I can start, I just really quickly, because I just listening to Derrick and Alex and Manisha, all these ideas about books that I wish I could do and just won't have the time. But I listened to Manisha, and a pattern that runs throughout the slave's cause are the female abolitionists. But one thing that I've always been fascinated with, and I hope she will take up in her work, is the marriage between the abolitionist movement and women's rights, because no good, in my estimation, no real good book has been done on that since Eileen Creditor and the Means and Ends of Abolitionism back in the 1970s. And there's a lot to be done in that field because women have been given the short shrift historically, I think, in the abolitionist movement. And I listened to Alex, and one of the criticisms my book got, and again, I want to emphasize that my book is a starting point. It's not the be all end all. It's a starting point. More work needs to be done on William Still. And hopefully scholars will benefit from that. But I listened to Alex, and Alex is absolutely right. Still's Carolyn Still was a pioneering female physician, and most of the stuff that's in the Bloxham collection is her stuff. Very little is known about her brothers or her younger sister. There needs to be a good book done on Carolyn Still, and that goes beyond her participation in the selling of her father's various editions. And I think Derrick has probably with his work and where he's going, I would really love to see him, because of the critical race theory today, take up that dialectic that I talked about, because it is so clear. I mean, that dialectic between the passive and the aggressive, the docile and the proactive. We see that throughout Black history. And in this day and age, with the problems that this country has, I think a good scholarly work that would deal with that issue in the context of the critical race theory would be a marvelous contribution. So if I can jump in right there, Bill, I do actually look at abolitionist feminists. They're a really important part of the book. There's a whole chapter on them. Right. They're there throughout. But the 1850s women's rights movement as such, I had a whole section which I had to cut out because they said, you can't write the history of the abolition movement and the women's rights movement and everything else. It was a big book already. But luckily, because I am carrying the story forward to Reconstruction and the fight over suffrage, I have been able to go back to that material from the 1850s and include this in the new book. But to go back to the sort of dichotomy that you create, between these, and that's been kind of the traditional way sometimes to understand Black political thought and the radical tradition. But I would actually, question that a little bit. I think many times we create those dichotomies. And what we find, if you look at the complex story of African-American activism, they don't come out as these two opposed, ideas of protest. They find them far more mixed and intermingled. And I was taken by what you said about William Still,
his sort of Garrisonian frugality and strictness. I mean, I think that maybe there was a generational divide. I think you're probably right about that. But this is a man who engaged in a lot of direct action in Philadelphia over fugitive slaves. So I don't think one can characterize him. In fact, I don't even think Garrison himself is always caricatured as this pacifist, moral suasionist. And if you read what they're actually doing, it's actually far more complicated. They do different things at different times. Even the notion that one group is completely apolitical, I think I sort of question those categories quite a bit in the slaves cause. I am really interested in the ways in which both Derrick and Alex have brought the Underground Railroad. It's the sort of close literary reading that Derrick did, which was really fantastic, and the publication history that Alex brought to life. As historians, we tend to try to do the big picture always, and I think what we lose out sometimes is precisely the kinds of readings that literary scholars get to it. And I was just wondering if you both just wanted to talk about that. I myself discovered literary scholars, an interdisciplinary approach, early Black print culture through literary scholars, because historians of abolition had basically just ignored them. When I started looking at that, I remember a lot of my readers saying, this is not evidence. This is not historical evidence. It's like a novel or a narrative or a poem, and they would dismiss my use of it. But I really benefited from that, and I was just wondering whether you both want to comment on that, on the sort of different sort of disciplinary approaches, the way we look at literary works, but also the production of literary work.
I'll go first, maybe Derrick, or we can trade off. I think one of the happy difficulties of researching William Still and Still's family is just how much material there is. And so, when I found myself initially, drafting and kind of in the research process, I would be doing these kinds of interpretation or analysis that you're talking about. And, both in terms of Still's own writing and the writing of, Caroline also has this really amazing correspondence, with her father, but also her husband at the time. So I guess a comment I would make is just that there is so much that you could do this kind of analysis with. And so I find, for example, what Derrick was talking about, talking about how Conklin and those early chapters set up the rest of the book, really helpful, because it provides like a key that you can use to read other passages, that may interest you or that may kind of engage with your students.
Thank you. Derrick, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think when I read Still carefully, what I recognize is something that I see playing out across Black intellectual history, Black activism in the antebellum period in particular, but even moving forward, is that he's struggling against a notion of Black activism that wants to reduce it to abolition, period. And he's publishing the Underground Railroad at a moment when the Liberator is ceasing publication because it's like mission accomplished, right? All these other organizations are sort of declaring shops closed, we're done, we're good, and Still sort of like, no. In the revised edition in 78, he says like these stories, and I'd even say the infrastructure he sort of surfaces in the construction of the book, says that's even more important now in Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, than it was even during the Underground Railroad days, because the same problems of white violence, the same problems of needing to protect community, the same issues of trying to reunite family members are there. And so when we read the Underground Railroad, what it is, I think Bill's right, is that it's a key to help folks find their people. And there's a wonderful project and book, Help Me Find My People, that outlines some of this work. And you'll see info wanted ads in the Christian Recorder as early as 64, 65, I think, right? But it's also like marking a lot of labor that went invisible, partly because of the nature of the road, but partly because it's such a complex story. How do you tell the story of Black America? right? But one person doesn't. It's partly the answer that William still gives us, right? It's a collective story. I just want to circle back to some of the other questions. I would say right now, if you want a foothold into the connections between feminism, especially Black feminism and abolitionism, I'd go to Martha Jones. She just gave a keynote today, one of the lectures today, Vanguard, back there somewhere with the yellow title, but also All Bound Up Together, which is a wonderful phrase from Frances Harper, as spaces, people who are doing that work. I just taught Jessica Marie Johnson's Wicked Flesh in my grad seminar today, that I think there's a generation of scholarship, and this isn't a sort of age question so much as books coming out sort of in the last couple of decades, where people are really attending to the immaterial angles. Johnson uses the word null archive to talk about all the things that we can't read sort of in documents, and sort of thinking about oral traditions and practices, et cetera. And then the last thing I say on this is that I think I tend to agree that the binary oppositions obscure a lot of agreement that's happening. And for me, the question is less sort of whether or not someone like Steele is passive or docile, and more if everyone is sort of actively engaged in the problem. It's a question of where that activity is happening. It's not that Steele is more or less engaged than Keto. It's more that he's putting his energy here. I think Steele maybe even suffers from the same sort of historical framing that took Frances Ellen Watkins Harper off our radar for a few decades, and that people would read Harper in the late 19th, early 20th century context to see her as not as radical, because the frame for radicalism was that new generation that were literally standing on her shoulders. But properly contextualized, it's less who's more radical and more, where's the energy going? How can we see the big picture of the movement?
Yeah, I would actually second that and say that, we think of these things as recent and as discoveries, but, Black historians and scholars have been talking about these people for a long time. They're being discovered now by scholars and, by mainstream society. But, Frances Harper was a celebrity in her time. And one of the reasons why I like Still's work so much is not only does he contain these sort of vignettes about these particular abolitionists and particular abolitionist feminists, he really does bring alive the movement also, which I really appreciated. For a long time, African Americans were literally written out of the abolition movement. And I found that to be a little appalling, because they were really at the forefront of it. So if you think about people like Jacob White's Minute Book that has not been published, or you think about Sidney Howard Gaze has just been given the attention that it deserves. But there were other Black abolitionists, like Robert Purvis burned all his papers connected to the Underground Railroad. So did John Parker, another Black abolitionist who was actually like going into the South and rescuing people, a bit like Tubman. And so there's so much that has been lost. So I really take to heart what Derrick said about archives and, constructive nature of our archives, because there's a lot that's missing. And that's what I found early Black print culture to be so helpful, because if you went straight to the anti-slavery collection, others, you got these vast troves of papers that white abolitionists had left. But you really had to look for Black abolitionism in that early print culture, in newspapers, in fragments. And I think work that has been done by Eric Gardner and others has been really great for this. But I have to give a shout out to my student, Johanna Ortner, who just defended her dissertation on Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who discovered forest sleeves that was thought lost to history. So I'm sure there are treasures there waiting for us to discover.
Yeah. Thank you, Manisha, for that. And I know I saw Bill kind of like with his mouth open, so I'm going to be quiet and let you all speak. But I do think that there is something about the the rediscovery of these sources. And there is something that is a bit scary about the underfunding and the closure of certain archival spaces. So I know for me, when I started my master's program at Clark Atlanta University many, many moons ago, Janice Sumler Edmond, one of the architects of the Association of Black Women Historians, introduced us to Dorothy Wesley Porter's compilation of early Negro writings, right? And I mean, all of these names that each one of you listed tonight, and I'll be sure to put, thank you so much. I will put that link in, put that book title in the link, but it contains so much about the work they were doing on the ground, right? And all of these writings are by Black people, you know, across the span of time. And so there is something really important about the archives and the because we're just rediscovering what already was. And so I just thank you so much for bringing that to the forefront, Manisha. So I will put that. Yes, we do have a question. Denise Berger, who is a former fellow of the Library Company, says, I found references to the abolitionist activities and passing references in descriptions and local histories of unremarkable Black women, which pushes us to think about the ways that all Black people were deputized into the Underground Railroad, but could not leave evidence of the same. The history show up in church bulletins and obituaries. We need to rethink our sources. And also thank you, Derrick, for putting in that title. Thank you for that comment, Denise.
Yeah, and I was just thinking obituaries. Harriet Myers, wife of Stephen Myers, the upstate New York abolitionist, we learned in her obituary that she handled some of the editorial duties of his newspaper. And just the number of ways that things like obituaries and church bulletins and flyers allow us to really flesh out the networks of people and associations and all that behind the ground stuff. Also, shout out the Colored Conventions Project. It's doing so much of that work. Denise has been active with that project for years now. So
another good example is Julia Garnett helping Henry Highland Garnett write. He actually says that she helped me compose and address the slaves. So there's a lot of hidden labor of Black women that we need to uncover. There's a very good dissertation from the University of Pittsburgh, but which will hopefully be out as a book soon, by Jesse Olsowski on the Underground Railroad. And he just goes deep down into the grassroots activism. And he has this whole narrative of Black women's activism that is going to be quite fascinating when it comes out.
Thank you. We do have two questions. One from my CUNY colleague. I was a former professor at one of the CUNYs, Evan Turiano, says, my question is raised by a comment Professor Sinha made, but perhaps applicable to all the panelists. Professor Sinha quoted Garrison's terminological decision to use self-emancipation instead of fugitive for fear of legitimizing the illegality attached to their status. Other activists, including, I believe, William and Ellen Craft, embraced the identity of fugitive, foregrounding their status, and I'm using quotes as he writes it, outside the law, in their story and appeal. Historians now consider the same terminological decision usually between freedom seekers and fugitives from slavery, largely on the same points. What terms do you think we as historians can use to best capture the position of people who escaped slavery without unnecessarily legitimating the slaveholder worldview? And then this is very brief. Spencer Lewis also has a question, so you can think about answering his as Professor Sinha answers. Spencer Lewis would like you all to talk about women and their relationship to the AME Church within the context of this conversation tonight. Thank you both.
Great questions. Good question, Evan. As you know, there has been a lot of discussion recently over terminology, using enslaver instead of master, enslaved instead of slave, freedom seekers instead of fugitive slaves. Your question about how William and Ellen Craft sort of embrace the idea of fugitive is because they are forced to flee the country, right? They go to Canada and then they go to England, and then they are literally fugitives from the slaveholding republic. And I think that's a conscious decision on their part. I found it fascinating that Garrison always talked about runaway slaves and fugitive slaves as self-emancipated slaves. He thought that they should be given the credit for their own emancipation. And people forget that, a year before Garnett's address, both Gerrit Smith and Garrison had issued addresses to slaves saying, just run away. There's no way that the system will survive if enslaved people en masse leave the South. It was kind of a strange idea, but it probably would have been very difficult to implement. But the self-emancipated side, he started using that even more during the Civil War, when you had mass exodus of enslaved people to Union Army lines. I don't see it as so much as opposed as the particular circumstances in which people embrace those ideas. In terms of, what do I use? I find just for writing, I like to use freedom seeker to mix up just using always fugitive slaves. I prefer sometimes just saying runaway slaves, which was what they used at that time. I tend to mix up the way I'll use Black and African American, and if I'm referring to the convention movement and they call themselves colored convention, I will use the term they use then. I think one shouldn't get too bogged down with terminology, though we know how naming has always been such an important part. I mean, Patrick Rail's book does a wonderful job over naming controversies and how African Americans chose to be self-identified. And I think one should be sensitive to that. And when I was writing the book, I tended to use, African. When they wanted to use African, I used colored. When they self-identified as colored, or even Afro-American and African-American, because those terms are also used in the 19th century. So, I do think that those terms can be used interchangeably as long as they're not, something that people specifically object to or see as derogatory. So even though the new Negro movement embraced the term Negro with a capital N, I don't use it because most people don't like it and I don't like it. If I use terms like, quote, mulatto or quadroon, those kinds of very racist terms that were used, I would generally use them within quotation marks. I'm uncomfortable just using it the way sometimes historians do, just say that term as if it's a unproblematic term, So I think it really depends, I guess, on the terminology. I myself have moved back and forth between freedom seekers, self-emancipated slaves, fugitives from slavery.
An example I would add really quickly, in one of the prefaces that Still writes to the Underground Railroad, he has this kind of phrase, or this turn of phrase, where he refers to the once fugitives, now citizens. And so I think that's particularly meaningful, coming back to something Derrick was talking about earlier, as the Underground Railroad being a book, a Reconstruction era book, a post-Reconstruction era book, Still is thinking about the people kind of represented in the book, but also his audience in terms of that moment, even if most of the history he is retelling took place before the Civil War.
One thing that's, if I can add this, although it doesn't deal directly with naming, so to speak, but one thing I was fascinated with in Still's book is that he paid very close attention to skin hues. He would refer to various skin hues like dark chestnut, black, light colored. And what I had to do with this is, when I did the database, categorize into mulatto and black, in order to get any kind of read on this. But And it struck me that, and I thought it was very sad that not only did this caste system exist, because we know from our federal census the way inventory was taken, that they would identify mulatto or Black or quadroon, and there was a caste system within slavery, but even among the slaves themselves played into that. So I was struck, doing reading on the one drop rule and how it was a very important concept to still, extremely important.
Yeah, I think colorism is a whole different there's a whole
Right.
there's a whole different discussion and how it coincided sometimes with class. But there was a question about Amy Church and women, and I do talk a lot about Jaretta Lee and the struggle of Black women to actually to preach within the Amy Church. William Andrews has a really good book called Spiritual Narratives, where he looks at the narratives of these women, including Julia Foote, which is makes for really good reading. So just want to do that.
I am so sorry, and I wish we could continue this. We will need to end. We've gone just a little bit over, but I want us to end on a really happy note. Through the chat, I've posted information that William Still Day will be commemorated from this point out in the state of New Jersey, but also in Philadelphia. So this is wonderful news. Wherever you are, please, join me in raising tea, herbal tea, or whatever drink of choice to William Still, so that we will continue this wonderful commemoration. Thank you for the gathering of these brilliant minds, these scholars who've given us so much to think about, questions that still need to be asked. I am also always grateful to partner with the McNeil Center at the University of Pennsylvania, so that we're able to provide this kind of programming. And so on behalf of the library company and the program in African American history here, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful night.